Year 5 of Ramesses III's reign, 1181 BC. A woman who had been a queen 3 weeks earlier stood in chains before the temple of Amun at Karnak. Her Libyan robes had been stripped away and replaced with coarse Egyptian linen. Her hair, which had been braided with gold beads according to the customs of her people, had been cut and restyled in Egyptian fashion. The Egyptian priest standing before her held a papyrus scroll and spoke words she could barely understand. He was giving her a new name, Henutawi, Lady of the Two Lands. The irony was deliberate. She had lost her land, lost her people, lost her husband, who lay dead 300 miles to the west. Now she would be called Lady of the Two Lands that had destroyed everything she had been. Behind her, hundreds of other women stood in similar chains. Beside her, her 13-year-old daughter trembled, waiting for her own renaming. This was not a myth. This was not a legend passed down through generations and embellished with each telling. This was documented policy, recorded on the walls of Medinet Habu temple in hieroglyphic inscriptions that still exist today, depicted in stone reliefs that show exactly what happened to the families of men who challenged Egypt's power. This is the story of what Pharaoh Ramesses III did to the wives and daughters of his enemies. This is what the inscriptions document. This is what the archaeological evidence confirms. And this is why researchers continue finding traces of these women throughout Egypt, in genetic studies that show unexpected population mixing, in burial practices that combine Egyptian and non-Egyptian traditions, in the records of children born in temple harems who carried bloodlines from both sides of a war that ended 3,000 years ago. Before we continue, I need you to understand what you are about to hear. The woman I just described, the one being renamed Henutawi, is a composite character. She is built from documented evidence about what happened to thousands of real women, from inscriptions that list captives by category, from administrative papyri that track assignments of prisoners to various temple estates, from reliefs that show the presentation ceremonies in disturbing detail. I am using her story, and the story of her daughter, who I will call Takat, to make comprehensible what the dry administrative records document, but do not explain how it felt, what it meant. What was lost and what, against all odds, was preserved. If you want to understand how power operates across time and culture, how systematic abuse is documented in official records and then hidden in plain sight, then subscribe to this channel right now. We uncover the darkest chapters of ancient and modern history. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Have you visited Medinet Habu? Have you seen these reliefs? Do you know what they depict? Let me know. Now let us go back to the spring of 1181 before the Common Era, to the western edge of the Nile Delta, where the largest Libyan invasion force in generations was about to meet Egypt's armies. Egypt in the late 12th century, before the Common Era, was facing what historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread crisis throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Climate change was causing drought and famine. Trade networks were breaking down. The Sea Peoples, displaced populations from Anatolia and the Aegean, were migrating south along the coast, attacking and destroying cities. Major kingdoms like the Hittite Empire had collapsed completely. Egypt survived, but barely, and only through brutal military responses to constant threats. Ramesses III became pharaoh in 1186 before the Common Era. He was approximately 30 years old, son of Setnakte, who had seized power after a brief period of civil war and political chaos. Ramesses III modeled himself consciously on Ramesses II, the legendary warrior pharaoh who had ruled 67 years and had covered Egypt with monuments celebrating his power. Ramesses III wanted similar glory. He would get his chance through a series of defensive wars that would define his reign and provide him with thousands of captives to display as proof of Egypt's continued dominance. The Libyan peoples west of Egypt had been pressuring the Nile Delta for generations. The gradual desertification of the Sahara was forcing pastoral tribes eastward, seeking better grazing land and access to water. Small-scale raids and border skirmishes were common. But in year 5 of Ramesses, the third's reign, the Libu, Meshwesh, and several allied tribes organized something far more ambitious. A mass migration disguised as a military invasion, bringing not just warriors, but entire families, livestock, and household goods. The Egyptian inscriptions claim the invasion force numbered over 20,000 people, though this number may be exaggerated. What is not exaggerated is that this was a serious threat. The Libyan coalition was well organized and well equipped. If they had succeeded in establishing themselves in the delta, Egypt's food supply would have been compromised, and the pharaoh's authority would have been fatally weakened. Ramesses III mobilized Egypt's armies and marched west to meet the invasion. The battle took place at a location the Egyptian inscriptions call the Western Road, probably somewhere in the western delta, though the exact site has not been identified. The fighting lasted several days. The Egyptians had advantages in weapons technology, particularly bronze swords and composite bows that could shoot farther and more accurately than the weapons available to most Libyan warriors. Egypt also had superior organization, a professional military structure that had been refined over centuries of warfare. The Libyan coalition was defeated decisively. The Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu record this victory in detail, both in text and in carved reliefs that cover multiple walls of the temple. The hieroglyphic texts claim that 12,535 Libyan warriors were killed and over 1,000 taken prisoner. These numbers may be inflated for propaganda purposes, but the scale of the defeat is confirmed by multiple sources and by what happened next. Because the Egyptian forces did not just kill the warriors and go home. They captured the families. The inscriptions specifically mention that large numbers of women and children were taken as prisoners of war. The reliefs show these captives being marched in long lines, hands bound, children clinging to their mothers. The scenes are not subtle. They are propaganda designed to demonstrate that Egypt did not just defeat its enemies on the battlefield, but also dominated them completely, taking their women and children as spoils of war. Let me show you exactly what these reliefs depict. At Medinet Habu, on the outer walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple, there are multiple scenes showing the aftermath of the Libyan campaign. One relief shows the pharaoh standing in his chariot reviewing lines of captives. The captives are clearly identified as Libyan by their distinctive clothing and hairstyles. The women wear patterned dresses different from Egyptian linen. Their hair is braided and decorated with beads. Some carry infants. Others have young children walking beside them. The hieroglyphic caption above this relief reads, "The vile chief of the Libu, overthrown and captured along with his wives, his children, and all his people, brought as living captives to fill the workshops of his majesty and to people the temples of his father Amun." The language is clinical, bureaucratic. These are not people. They are resources to be allocated, labor to be distributed, property belonging to the pharaoh and to Egypt's gods. Another relief shows the presentation ceremony at Karnak temple. The pharaoh stands before the sanctuary of Amun, while lines of captive women are displayed before the god. The women are being offered as tribute, as gifts to Amun in thanks for granting victory. The inscription describes them as female captives of the countries, to increase the property of Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Again, the language treats them as property, as things rather than people. These inscriptions and reliefs are not hidden or obscure. They are prominent features of one of Egypt's most important temples. Thousands of tourists visit Medinet Habu every year and see these scenes, but most do not understand what they are looking at. Tour guides often gloss over the captive scenes or describe them vaguely as prisoners of war, without explaining what happened to these people after they were captured. The full horror of what these images document is rarely discussed in popular presentations of ancient Egyptian history. But scholarly analysis of these scenes, combined with administrative papyri from the 20th dynasty makes clear exactly what happened. The captive women and children were sorted into categories and distributed according to bureaucratic procedures that were well established by Ramesses III's time. Some captives were assigned to temple estates where they worked as agricultural laborers, weavers, or brewers. Some were given to military officers and high officials as household servants. And some, particularly younger women and girls, were assigned to royal and temple harems. The word harem requires explanation because it carries modern connotations that do not precisely match ancient Egyptian practice. The Egyptian term is cheneret, or ipt nesut, referring to residential quarters where royal women, concubines, female servants, and children associated with the king lived and worked. These were not just pleasure palaces. They were complex institutions that included workshops producing textiles and other luxury goods, administrative offices managing estates, and residential areas housing dozens or hundreds of women and children. But harems also served as sites of what we would now call institutionalized sexual exploitation. Women in harems were expected to be available for the pharaoh's sexual access. They were also sometimes granted as rewards to favored officials or priests. The system was framed through religious and royal ideology that treated the pharaoh's sexuality as a matter of state importance, as an expression of divine power that generated life and maintained cosmic order. But underneath the ideological framing, the practical reality was that women in harems had no autonomy, no ability to refuse, no legal recourse if they were abused. The woman I am calling Henatawi would have been processed through this system, along with hundreds of others captured in the Year 5 Libyan campaign. Let me be clear again. Henatawi is not a name I found in the captive lists. It is a plausible Egyptian name from this period that I am using for a composite character who represents what the evidence tells us happened to real women. We know from the inscriptions that captive women were renamed with Egyptian names. We know from administrative papyri that foreign women were assigned to specific harems. We know from multiple sources what conditions in these harems were like. I am using Henatawi's story to make this evidence comprehensible as human experience, rather than just bureaucratic record. After the battle at the Western Road, the captive women were held for several days, while Egyptian forces secured the area and organized the march to Thebes. This was approximately 300 miles through a combination of desert terrain and Nile Valley routes. The journey would take several weeks. The captives walked, bound together with ropes. Those who could not keep pace were left behind. Children who were too young to walk either had to be carried by their mothers or were left behind as well. The march itself was designed to break the captives psychologically, to exhaust them so completely that by the time they reached Thebes, they would be too traumatized to organize resistance. Imagine being in Henatawi's position. Your husband is dead, killed in battle 3 days earlier. You watched Egyptian soldiers cut off his hands as trophies, a practice documented in the Medinet Habu reliefs, which show piles of severed hands being counted and recorded by scribes. Your home is destroyed. Your people are scattered. You are bound with ropes around your wrists and neck. Your 13-year-old daughter is beside you, terrified and exhausted. You are walking through desert heat with minimal water and food. Egyptian soldiers guard you, men who speak a language you do not understand, who view you as property they have captured. And you know, because you understand how warfare works, even if you do not know the specific details, that when you reach wherever they are taking you, your situation will get worse. You will be a prisoner in a foreign land. You will have no rights, no protection, no way to return home. Your daughter will face the same fate. You can do nothing to protect her. You can do nothing to protect yourself. You can only survive moment to moment and hope that somehow the situation will become bearable. The captives reached Thebes in approximately the 3rd month after the battle. Thebes was Egypt's religious capital, home to the massive Karnak temple complex, dedicated to Amun-Ra, and to the necropolis on the west bank where pharaohs built their mortuary temples. The city must have seemed incomprehensibly vast to women from semi-nomadic Libyan tribes. The architecture, the crowds, the wealth on display, everything would have reinforced that they were completely out of their element, powerless in a civilization that operated according to rules they did not understand. The first stop was Karnak Temple for the presentation ceremony. This was a major public event, attended by Egyptian nobles, officials, priests, and probably foreign ambassadors and merchants who were in Thebes. The captive women were displayed in the temple courtyards, while Ramesses III stood before the sanctuary of Amun and formally offered them as tribute to the god. Priests chanted hymns. Incense burned. Scribes recorded the numbers of captives in official records. This ceremony served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was religious ritual, giving thanks to Amun for granting military victory and offering a portion of the spoils to the god's estate. It was political theater, demonstrating Ramesses III's power to Egyptian elites who needed to see that their pharaoh was successfully defending Egypt against foreign threats. And it was psychological warfare aimed at foreign observers who would report back to their own rulers that Egypt crushed its enemies so completely that even the wives and children of enemy leaders became Egyptian property. After the presentation ceremony, the sorting began. Egyptian administrators had been conducting this process for centuries and had developed standardized procedures. Captives were evaluated based on age, physical condition, skills, and potential usefulness. Elderly people and very young children who could not work were probably killed or abandoned, though the records do not specify this explicitly. Healthy adult women were categorized as agricultural workers, craft workers, or household servants depending on assessment of their capabilities. Young women and girls, particularly those who appeared to be from noble families based on their clothing and bearing, were often designated for assignment to harems. Administrative papyri from the 20th dynasty, particularly the Great Harris Papyrus, which inventories temple properties and gifts during Ramesses III's reign, confirm that thousands of foreign captives were distributed to various temple estates. The papyrus lists specific numbers of Syrians, Nubians, and Libyans given to Amun's estate, to Ra's estate, to Pa's estate. The captives are listed alongside cattle, grain, and precious metals. They are property being donated to religious institutions. Henatawi and her daughter, in my composite narrative, were both assigned to the harem attached to Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. This temple was still under construction during the early part of Ramesses III's reign, but was functional enough to house a harem by year 6 or year 7. The harem quarters were substantial structures built adjacent to the temple, housing perhaps 200 to 300 women at maximum capacity, along with children and the administrative staff who managed daily operations. When Henatawi and her daughter arrived at the Medinet Habu harem, they underwent an assimilation process designed to strip away their foreign identity and reconstruct them as Egyptians. First, their Libyan clothing was removed. Libyan dress typically included distinctive patterned textiles, leather elements, and jewelry that marked tribal affiliation. All of this was taken away and replaced with simple Egyptian linen, plain white pleated garments that were standard for servants and workers. Their hair was cut and restyled. Libyan women wore their hair in elaborate braids, often decorated with beads, shells, or metal ornaments. These braids were cut off. The hair was restyled in Egyptian fashion, simpler cuts that required less maintenance, and that marked the women as no longer Libyan. The physical transformation was immediate and shocking, a visible marker that their old identity was being erased. Then came the renaming. This was formalized in a ceremony where a priest or high official would assign each woman an Egyptian name that would replace her birth name in all official records. The new names were often ironic or propagandistic. Henatawi, Lady of the Two Lands, for a woman who had lost her land, Takat, She of the Land, for the daughter. These names proclaimed Egyptian ownership over foreign women, claiming them as belonging to Egypt now. The women were also assigned to specific work details. The Medinet Habu harem was not just a residence, it was a productive workshop. Most women worked in textile production, weaving linen that would be used in temple rituals or traded for other goods. Some worked in food preparation, brewing beer and baking bread for the temple staff. Some worked in agricultural areas attached to the harem estate, tending gardens and processing crops. The work was mandatory and closely supervised. Women who did not meet production quotas faced punishment. But the primary function of the harem, beyond labor extraction, was reproductive. The women in the harem were expected to bear children who would belong to the pharaoh or to the temple estate. This expectation was not framed as sexual slavery in Egyptian ideological terms. Instead, it was presented as the women's duty to serve the pharaoh who embodied both royal and divine authority. Women who bore children were fulfilling their purpose within the cosmic order that placed the pharaoh at the center of Egyptian society and religion. The practical reality was that women had no choice. They could be accessed sexually by Ramesses III when he visited the harem. They could be accessed by high officials or priests who had been granted such privileges as rewards for loyal service. The phrase, found in some administrative texts, is that certain officials were given access rights to specific groups of harem women. The bureaucratic language obscures what this meant in human terms. It meant rape, legitimized through religious and royal ideology, systematized through administrative procedures, and normalized as simply how society functioned. If this story is disturbing you, if you are starting to understand that ancient Egyptian civilization, for all its monumental architecture and artistic achievement, was built on systems of exploitation that destroyed countless lives, then share this video. Hit that like button to help others find this content. And tell me in the comments what you think our responsibility is to these women. Should we tell their stories even though the evidence is fragmentary? Should we use composite characters to make comprehensible what bureaucratic records document but do not explain? Let me know your thoughts. Now let me tell you about what happened during the years these women spent in the harem, about how some preserved their identities despite systematic erasure, and about the children who were born from this system. Daily life in the Medinet Habu harem followed strict routines designed to maintain control and maximize productivity. Women woke at dawn and immediately began their assigned work. Textile workers sat at looms for hours weaving linen. Food preparation workers ground grain, kneaded dough, brewed beer. The work was monotonous and physically demanding. Women who slowed down or made mistakes faced punishment, ranging from reduced food rations to beatings. The harem was supervised by an overseer, usually an older Egyptian woman who had spent her career managing harems and understood how to maintain discipline. The overseer reported to a high official called the steward of the royal harem, who managed multiple harems throughout Egypt. These administrative positions were prestigious, demonstrating that harem management was considered an important governmental function. The overseer maintained order through a combination of rewards and punishments. Women who worked diligently, who learned Egyptian quickly, who caused no problems, received better food, slightly better sleeping quarters, less demanding work assignments. Women who resisted, who spoke their native languages, who tried to preserve foreign customs, faced harsh consequences. Punishment could be physical, beatings administered by guards or by the overseer herself. Or it could be worse, transfer to military camps, where women served soldiers, conditions that were universally understood to be far more brutal than anything experienced in temple harems. Most foreign women learned quickly to comply outwardly. They wore Egyptian clothing without complaint. They answered to their Egyptian names. They performed their assigned work. They learned to speak Egyptian well enough to understand orders and communicate basic needs. But inward compliance was another matter. Many women found ways to preserve elements of their identity in secret, hidden from Egyptian supervisors who would punish such preservation if discovered. We know this happened because of evidence found at Deir el-Medina, a village near Thebes that housed the workers who built and decorated royal tombs. Deir el-Medina had a population that included foreign workers and captives integrated into the Egyptian workforce. Archaeologists have excavated thousands of ostraca, limestone flakes used as cheap writing surfaces, from Deir el-Medina. Some of these ostraca contain texts in multiple languages or scripts, suggesting that foreign workers were preserving their languages despite official pressure to use only Egyptian. While we do not have ostraca specifically from the Medinet Habu harem that survived and were excavated, we can reasonably infer that similar practices occurred there. Women who knew how to write, or who learned to write from other women, could have recorded thoughts, prayers, or histories in ways that looked Egyptian to casual inspection but that preserved foreign cultural content. They could have used Egyptian script to write words from their own languages phonetically, creating documents that appeared to be Egyptian but that actually contained hidden meaning. They could also have preserved culture through oral tradition. Lullabies sung to children at night in sleeping chambers where Egyptian supervisors were not present. Stories told in whispered conversations. Prayers offered to gods the Egyptians did not recognize. These oral traditions would leave no direct archaeological evidence. But we know from anthropological studies of populations in captivity across many cultures and time periods that oral tradition is remarkably resilient. People find ways to pass down language, songs, stories, even when those things are explicitly forbidden. Hanuttawi, in my composite narrative, represents women who engaged in this resistance. During the day, she worked at the looms producing linen. She spoke Egyptian. She answered to her Egyptian name. She appeared to have accepted her situation. But at night, when the work was done and women were allowed a few hours of rest before the next day began, Hanuttawi would whisper to her daughter in Libu, teaching her words from their language that was being systematically erased. She would sing lullabies her own mother had sung to her, songs in Libu that preserved something of who they had been before capture. This resistance was dangerous. If Egyptian supervisors discovered foreign women speaking their native languages or teaching them to children, punishment would be severe. Women could be beaten, could be isolated, could be transferred to worse situations. But some women accepted that risk because the alternative, complete erasure of their identity, was worse than physical punishment. They would rather face beating than allow their culture to die without any attempt to preserve it. The children born in the harem complicated everything. Hanuttawi, in my composite narrative, bore her first child approximately 2 years after arriving at Medinet Habu. She would have been approximately 30 years old, still within prime childbearing years. The father's identity was probably not recorded. It could have been Ramesses III himself during one of his visits to the harem. It could have been a priest or official who had access rights. The administrative records do not specify paternity for most children born in harems. What mattered was that the child legally belonged to the temple estate, property just like the mother. The child was a boy. He was given an Egyptian name, probably something like Amenemopet or Konsuemheb, a name incorporating a god's name, as was standard Egyptian practice. He was registered in temple records as born to Hanuttawi, servant of the estate of Ramesses. The mother's name was recorded because lineage was traced through mothers in harem contexts, but no father was listed. The boy would grow up in the harem environment, eventually being assigned to work in temple service or possibly being given to an official as a household servant. Hanuttawi's daughter, whom I am calling Takhat, faced a different path. She had been 13 when captured. By her 3rd or 4th year in the harem, she would have been 16 or 17, old enough by ancient standards to be considered an adult woman. Young women born in harems or brought there as girls were particularly valuable to the harem administration because they could be molded completely into Egyptian culture, having fewer memories of alternative identities than women captured as adults. Takhat was probably selected for what Egyptian texts euphemistically call sacred service, work that combined household duties with availability for sexual access by priests and officials. This was framed through religious ideology as serving the gods. Women who performed such service were described in texts as being devoted to specific gods, as if their service was voluntary religious dedication. The reality was that they had no choice, and that their service primarily benefited human men who used religious ideology to justify sexual access to captive women. Takhat bore her first child when she was approximately 17 years old. The child was a daughter. Over the following 8 years, Takhat would bear 3 more children, 2 daughters, and a son. All were registered as temple property. None were acknowledged as having specific fathers. The children would be raised partially by their mother, but primarily by the harem's collective childcare, older women who were past childbearing age and were assigned to supervise and train the next generation. These children, born to captive foreign women, existed in an ambiguous category that Egyptian society struggled to define. They were not free. They belonged to temples or royal estates. They could be used as labor, could be sold, could be given away as gifts. But they were also biologically connected to Egypt's religious and administrative elite, the priests and officials who had fathered them. And many showed physical characteristics that mixed Egyptian and foreign traits, creating visible evidence of population mixing that complicated Egypt's ideological claims about the superiority of Egyptian bloodlines. The propaganda value of these children was significant. Ramesses III displayed them regularly in public ceremonies, designed to demonstrate that Egypt did not just defeat its enemies militarily, but absorbed them culturally, transforming foreign blood into Egyptian identity through forced integration. The Medinet Habu reliefs include scenes showing the pharaoh standing before lines of children described in inscriptions as born from captive women. The children wear Egyptian clothing. Their heads are shaved in Egyptian style, except for the side lock worn by children. They are presented as proof that Egyptian civilization was so powerful that even children of foreign enemies could be made Egyptian through proper training. One inscription, accompanying these relief scenes, describes the children as pure ones without stain, born of the captives brought from foreign lands, now serving in the house of Amun. The language is telling. The children are described as pure despite their foreign ancestry. This purity is conferred not by blood, but by their service to Egyptian gods and their upbringing in Egyptian culture. The propaganda message was that Egyptian identity was not primarily about ancestry, but about cultural and religious participation. Anyone could become Egyptian if properly integrated into Egyptian systems. But not all Egyptians accepted this ideology uncritically. The same inscription notes that some objected to calling these children pure and to allowing them to participate in certain temple rituals. The text does not elaborate on who objected or what their reasoning was, but the mere mention of objections suggests there was debate within Egyptian society about how to classify children born from foreign captive women. Were they Egyptian? Were they foreign? Were they something in between? This debate had practical implications. Children who were classified as fully Egyptian could potentially inherit property, could serve in priestly roles, could marry into Egyptian families. Children who were classified as foreign would remain property, excluded from opportunities available to freeborn Egyptians. The ambiguity created opportunities for some children to improve their status, but it also created uncertainty and potential exploitation. In year 11 of Ramesses III's reign, approximately 6 years after the first Libyan campaign, another major Libyan invasion occurred. The Meshwesh tribe, apparently undeterred by their earlier defeat, organized another coalition and attempted another large-scale attack on Egypt's western border. Ramesses III defeated this invasion even more decisively than the first, with the Medinet Habu inscriptions claiming over 2,000 enemy warriors killed and thousands more captured. The captives from the Year 11 campaign were processed exactly as those from Year 5 had been. They were marched to Thebes, presented as tribute at Karnak, sorted and distributed to various estates. The Medinet Habu harem received another influx of Libyan women and children. The harem population swelled to probably close to its maximum capacity of 300 women and children. This created new social dynamics within the harem. The women who had been captured in year 5 had now spent 6 years in the Egyptian system. They had learned the language, had learned the customs, had borne children, had adapted to their situation as much as possible. The newly arrived women from year 11 were still in shock, still grieving, still struggling to understand what was happening to them. The older captives became teachers in some cases, explaining the rules, helping the newer women avoid mistakes that would lead to punishment. But there was also tension. Some of the older captives had become invested in the system, had accepted their Egyptian identities, either genuinely or strategically. They enforced rules about not speaking foreign languages. They reported women who tried to preserve non-Egyptian practices. They had, in effect, become collaborators, choosing to align with their captors to improve their own positions within the harem hierarchy. This is a common pattern in systems of captivity and forced assimilation. Some captives resist, some comply outwardly, while preserving identity inwardly. And some genuinely adopt the identity of their captors, either through psychological necessity or through strategic calculation that collaboration offers better chances for survival and potential advancement. All of these responses are understandable, given the impossible situations captive people face. None should be judged without recognizing the constraints that make resistance dangerous and adaptation necessary. By year 20 of Ramesses III's reign, the Medinet Habu harem had been operating for approximately 15 years, since the first major influx of Libyan captives. The harem housed not just the original captive women, many now in their 40s or 50s, but also their children, now teenagers or young adults, and their grandchildren. A third generation born entirely within the harem system, with no memory of any life outside Egyptian control. These second and third generation children were Ramesses, the third's most powerful propaganda tools. He displayed them in major public ceremonies, particularly during Jubilee festivals celebrating his long reign. The Great Harris Papyrus, which documents Ramesses III's donations and achievements, mentions several large festivals where children from the royal harems were presented as evidence of Egypt's prosperity and power. The children were dressed identically in fine Egyptian linen, their hair styled identically in Egyptian fashion. They were living proof that Egypt transformed its enemies into Egyptians, that Egyptian civilization was so powerful that even biology could be overcome through proper cultural training. But the display of these children also revealed anxieties. The inscriptions repeatedly emphasize that the children are pure and without stain. This repetition suggests that purity was questionable, that it needed to be asserted rather than assumed. Egyptian society was grappling with how to integrate a generation of children who were biologically mixed, but who had been raised entirely within Egyptian cultural systems. The propaganda insisted they were Egyptian. The reality was more complicated. Modern genetic research has provided some insight into this question of population mixing in ancient Egypt. Studies of ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies and skeletal remains have shown that New Kingdom Egypt had higher levels of genetic diversity than is sometimes assumed, with evidence of population movement from both south and west. Populations in the Nile Valley showed genetic connections to Nubian, Libyan, and other North African groups, consistent with the historical evidence of extensive captive taking during Egypt's New Kingdom military campaigns. These genetic studies do not provide precise percentages or allow identification of specific individuals, but they confirm the broad pattern that the documentary evidence suggests. Egypt's population was not genetically isolated. The military campaigns that brought thousands of foreign captives into Egypt over centuries of New Kingdom expansion resulted in significant population mixing. Even as Egyptian ideology insisted on Egyptian cultural and religious superiority and tried to minimize the significance of foreign ancestry, the archaeological record also shows evidence of cultural mixing. Burial practices from the later New Kingdom sometimes include elements that are not traditionally Egyptian, suggesting that some people were maintaining or incorporating non-Egyptian cultural practices even while living within Egyptian society. Objects found in tombs occasionally include items that appear to be of Libyan or Nubian origin, preserved alongside Egyptian funerary equipment. One particularly interesting find comes from excavations at a cemetery associated with temple workers at Deir el-Medina. Several burials from the late 20th dynasty show individuals who were interred with both Egyptian and non-Egyptian elements. Standard Egyptian mummification and coffins, but also small amulets or items placed in the grave that were not part of traditional Egyptian funerary practice. These mixed burials suggest that even after decades of living in Egyptian society, some people or their families were maintaining connections to non-Egyptian cultural traditions. These archaeological traces are fragmentary and open to multiple interpretations, but they align with what we would expect based on the documentary evidence. Forced assimilation was extensive, but not total. Some captive women and their descendants found ways to preserve elements of their identity, despite systematic efforts to erase foreign cultures and replace them with Egyptian identity. In year 31 of Ramesses III's reign, 1156 before the Common Era, a conspiracy emerged within the royal household that became known as the Harem conspiracy. This is documented in detail in the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a legal text that records the trials of the conspirators. The conspiracy involved multiple people, including a woman named Ta, who was one of Ramesses III's minor wives and who wanted her son Pentaweret to become pharaoh instead of Ramesses III's designated successor. The conspirators used what the Egyptian texts call magic, probably meaning poison or other methods of harm that were attributed to supernatural causes. The conspiracy was detected, and the conspirators were arrested and tried. The Judicial Papyrus records the trials and punishments. Ta and other women involved were executed. Pentaweret was forced to commit suicide. Multiple officials who had participated were also executed or severely punished. The harem conspiracy is relevant to our story for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that women in the royal harems were not passive victims without any agency. They had access to resources, to information, to networks of people who could be recruited into conspiracies. The harems were sites of political activity, not just sexual exploitation. Second, the conspiracy shows that even within the most controlled environments, resistance and opposition were possible. The women involved in the conspiracy risked their lives, but they took that risk in an attempt to change their circumstances and advance their interests. Third, the harem conspiracy raises questions about whether captive foreign women might have been involved. The Judicial Papyrus does not specify the backgrounds of all the women who participated in the conspiracy. It is possible that some were Egyptian noblewomen who had their own political agendas, but it is also possible that some were foreign captives or daughters of captives who saw an opportunity to strike back at the system that had enslaved them and their mothers. We cannot know for certain. The evidence does not allow that level of specificity, but it is worth considering that foreign women in the harems had every reason to oppose Ramesses III, had seen their families destroyed and their identities erased, and might have viewed a conspiracy against the pharaoh as justified revenge for what had been done to them. Ramesses III died in year 32 of his reign, 1155 before the Common Era. He was approximately 61 years old and had ruled Egypt for 31 years. Whether he died from the assassination attempt or from natural causes is debated by scholars. The physical evidence from his mummy shows a severe throat wound that could have been fatal, suggesting the conspiracy might have succeeded at least partially, even though the conspirators were caught and punished. After Ramesses III's death, the 20th dynasty continued for several more rulers but in declining circumstances. Egypt faced economic problems, administrative corruption, labor unrest, and continued military threats. The power and wealth that had characterized Egypt during the early New Kingdom period was fading. Within a few generations, Egypt would be ruled by foreign dynasties. Libyans ironically gaining control peacefully through political integration, what their ancestors had failed to take by military conquest. The Medinet Habu harem continued operating during the late 20th dynasty, but with reduced resources and significance. References to the harem in papyri from the reigns of later Ramesses pharaohs suggest it housed fewer women, received less funding, had less political importance. By the 21st dynasty beginning in 1069 before the Common Era, the Medinet Habu harem may have been closed entirely, or reduced to a minimal staff. What happened to the captive Libyan women and their descendants during this period is not documented in detail. Some probably died in the harem. Some may have been freed or sold when the harem was reduced in size. Some of their descendants probably married into Egyptian families and disappeared into the general population, their foreign ancestry becoming less significant with each generation of intermarriage. But the genetic legacy persisted. Modern Egyptians, particularly those from regions near the western border, carry genetic markers that connect them to ancient Libyan populations. These genetic connections confirm what the historical evidence suggests, that the captive-taking documented in Ramesses III's inscriptions resulted in permanent population changes, bringing Libyan bloodlines into Egyptian gene pools where they remain today. There are also cultural survivals. Some practices and beliefs in modern Egyptian culture, particularly in Western Egypt, show influences that appear to predate Egyptian conversion to Christianity and Islam, possibly preserving elements of ancient Libyan or other North African traditions. Anthropologists who study these cultural practices have noted songs, stories, and rituals that do not fit neatly into mainstream Egyptian cultural patterns, and that may represent extremely old cultural continuities. Whether any of these specific cultural elements can be traced directly to the women captured by Ramesses III is impossible to determine with certainty. 3,000 years is a long time for oral traditions to persist without change. But the possibility exists. Cultural memory can be remarkably resilient. Things that were supposed to be erased sometimes survive in fragments, in practices whose original meanings have been forgotten but whose forms continue. The Medinet Habu temple still stands on the west bank at Luxor. It is one of Egypt's best preserved New Kingdom temples, a massive stone structure covered with reliefs and inscriptions documenting Ramesses III's reign. Thousands of tourists visit every year. They walk through the courtyards where captive women were once displayed. They see the reliefs showing lines of bound captives being presented to the pharaoh. They read the inscriptions, claiming great victories over foreign enemies. But most visitors do not understand the full implications of what they are seeing. The bound women in the reliefs are not just artistic motifs. They represent real people who were captured, transported hundreds of miles, forcibly assimilated into Egyptian culture, and used as labor and reproductive resources for Egyptian temples and royal estates. The triumphant inscriptions describing Egypt's victories omit what happened after the battles, the decades of systematic exploitation that the captured families endured. This omission is not unique to presentations of ancient Egyptian history. Monumental architecture and official inscriptions across cultures and time periods tend to celebrate power while minimizing or ignoring the suffering that power inflicted. Tourists want to be awed by ancient achievements. They want to admire impressive monuments. They do not necessarily want to confront uncomfortable questions about the human costs of those achievements. But historians and archaeologists have a responsibility to tell more complete stories. The women whose experiences I have tried to make comprehensible through the composite characters of Henetoy and her daughter represent thousands of real people whose lives were destroyed by Ramesses III's military campaigns. Those women deserve to have their experiences documented and remembered, not as minor footnotes to triumphal narratives, but as central to understanding what ancient Egyptian power actually meant for the people it dominated. The evidence is there. The Medinet Habu reliefs show the captive women. The inscriptions describe their distribution to temples and estates. Administrative papyri document the operation of harems. The judicial papyrus reveals conspiracies within those harems. Genetic studies confirm population mixing consistent with large-scale captive integration. Archaeological evidence shows cultural hybridization despite ideological insistence on Egyptian purity. All of these sources tell us that what I have described through composite narrative is grounded in documented historical reality. Henatawi and Tokat are not real names of women I can identify in the ancient records, but women exactly like them existed. They were captured in Ramesses III's campaigns. They were marched to Thebes and displayed as tribute. They were renamed and dressed in Egyptian clothing and assigned to harems. They bore children who were legally enslaved. They tried to preserve their identities despite systematic erasure. Some succeeded partially, some failed, all suffered. Their story matters because it forces us to confront how power operates, how official narratives obscure systematic abuse, how impressive monuments often rest on foundations of exploitation and violence. It matters because recognizing patterns of domination in ancient history helps us recognize similar patterns in other contexts. It matters because the women who experienced this deserve to be remembered as people, not just as categories in administrative records or artistic motifs in propaganda reliefs. What do you think of this story? How should we remember Ramesses III as a great defender of Egypt who maintained order during the Bronze Age collapse? As a systematic abuser who enslaved thousands of women and children? Can historical figures be both simultaneously? How do we hold those contradictions? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how we should approach ancient history, whose voices should be centered, what responsibilities we have to people who were deliberately erased from official records. If you believe uncomfortable history is important history, that we have responsibility to document systematic cruelty even when it was committed by people ancient societies celebrated, then subscribe to this channel. We give voice to experiences that official narratives tried to hide. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with people who want to understand how power operates across cultures and time periods. The Medinet Habu reliefs will be there for thousands more years, carved in stone, proclaiming Ramesses III's victories over his enemies. The inscriptions will continue describing captives brought to fill workshops and populate temples. The tourists will continue visiting and admiring the monumental architecture. But now you know what those images document. Now you understand what happened to the women and children in those relief carvings. Now you can see the human experience behind the bureaucratic language and triumphalist propaganda. See you in the next video.